Unit 18 Sovereignty. Contents 18.1 Introduction, 18.2 The Rise of Sovereign States, 18.3 Conceptions of Sovereignty, 18.4 Legal and Political Sovereignty, 18.5 Internal Sovereignty, 18.6 External Sovereignty, 18.7 Conclusion, and 18.8 Further Reading. Learning Objectives. After studying this unit, you will be able to discuss the rise of sovereign status, legal and political sovereignty, explain the difference between internal and external sovereignty. 18.1 Introduction. Sovereignty is an important element of the state which distinguishes the state from other political associations within a society and similar entities in the international society. The origin and history of the idea of sovereignty is intimately connected with the origin and development of the territorial states in modern times. It is for these reasons that the meaning of sovereignty has undergone change across history. Despite the many meaning of the concept, sovereignty has a core meaning. Hensley, an eminent political scientist, captures the core meaning of sovereignty when he says that it is the idea that there is a final and absolute political authority in the political community and that no final and absolute authority exists elsewhere. Sovereignty then is an assumption about authority. We might say that sovereignty is the basic assumptions about the authority of modern political life, domestically and internationally. Authority is the right or title to rule. Sovereignty is the assumption that the government of a state is both supreme and independent. It is supreme over everybody who lives in its territorial jurisdiction, and it is independent from other governing authorities. The concept of sovereignty has been controversial in academic discourse. To a large measure, this is because of the contrasting ways in which it is used to refer to independence and to autonomy. The former is a notion of authority and right, but the second is a notion of power and capability. While historians, international lawyers, and political theorists tend to operate with the first concept, political economists and political sociologists tend to employ the later concept. These two categories, different approaches to the sovereignty, exist and must be borne in mind as we proceed to analyze the key concept in political thought. For this starting point, this unit examines the rise of the modern territorial states with which the concept is associated with. Thereafter, we will proceed to explain how the concept of sovereignty, which was originally associated with the rulers, came to be liked with the people of the ruled. We will also examine the two contrasting ways in which the concept has been used in political science and international relations. 18.2 The Rise of Sovereign States. Sovereignty is a constitutional arrangement of political life. It is thus artificial and historical. There is nothing about sovereignty that is natural or inevitable or immutable. In fact, the notion of sovereignty was absent before the modern territorial states came into being in Europe between the 15th and 17th centuries. The idea of sovereignty was not part of an ancient classical Greek world. The city-states or polis did not differentiate between state and society ruled as it was by citizen governments. The citizen was both a subject of state authority and also creator of public rules and regulations. The Roman Empire that eclipsed the Greek city-states established a new type of ruled by a single central authority. What pleased the emperor had the force of law. While the idea of sovereignty as a distinct form of law-making power was established, it did not outlive the Roman Empire. The idea of sovereignty was progressively submerged by the rise of Christian faith when the Roman Empire was succeeded by a highly decentralized system of feudal order. During this period, Christianity gradually came to depend two theocratic authorities, the papacy and the Holy Roman Empire. The source of authority and wisdom shifted from this worldly to the other worldly representatives. At the core of the Christian worldview was the belief that the good lay in submission to God's will. Law of nature of religious rules came to be regarded as superior to laws of state. As Ben and Peters point out, in the feudal world, the primary concept was not the state but a law not made by politician but part of a universal and eternal order to be discovered by a study of custom and precedent. Kings, councils, and judges found and formulated it but could not make it, for to create new law would be to impose a new obligation by an act of will, and only God could do that. Box 18.1 The Modern Age. That medieval order was weakened by two important movements that make the beginning of the modern age: the Renaissance and the Reformation. With the Renaissance led to the discovery of humanism as well as the principles and perceptions of Roman laws, and thus led to the new ways of thinking about political authority. The Reformation changed by the papal jurisdiction and authority across Europe. The weakening authority of the Church and the Holy Roman Empire was exploited by princes who asserted their authority over feudal lords and established centralized monarchies. In England, this was achieved under Tudor dynasty, in France under Bourbon, in Spain under the Habsburg. For the first time, secular rulers were able to claim to exercise supreme power, and this they did in a new language of sovereignty. As the territorial state was occupying the European continent piece by piece, eventually forming the state system that came to occupy the globe, contemporary politician philosophers embraced this form of polity and described what made it illegitimate. In the early years of the formation of territorial states in the Europe, two contemporary philosophers, Niccolo Machiavelli and Martin Luther, provided legitimacy to the idea of sovereignty of the territorial state. They did not write explicitly or consciously about sovereignty, yet their ideas mounted in substance to important development of the concept. Observing the politics of city-states in his Renaissance Italy, Machiavelli in 1949 to 1527 described what a prince had to do to promote the flourishing republic in the terms that conferred on him supreme authority within his territory. The prince, he advised, should not be bound by natural law, canon law, gospel prospect, or any of the norms of authority that obliged member of Christendom. The prince instead should be prepared to not to do good and perform evil, not because evil is no longer evil, but because it was sometimes necessary to further the cause of strong had well-ordered state. The obligation of the prince was race and defeat. The price was supreme within the state territory and responsible for the well-being of this singular unitary body. Martin Luther argued for sovereignty from a different perspective. His theology of Reformation sought to strip the Catholic Church of its many powers, and not only its ecclesiastical powers but temporal powers as well. Luther held that under the God's authority there exist two orders with the two forms of government. The realm of the Supreme Spirit was the power in which the Christian was related to the soul of the believer. The realm of the world was the order of the secular society where civil authorities ran other governmental institutions through law and coercion. Both the realm further the good of the believers, though in different stances. Luther argued that these two realms need to be separately organized within the leaders of the church performing spiritual duties, and the secular rulers and the princes, kings, and magistrates could perform temporal ones. Thus, even without discussing the doctrine of sovereignty, Luther and his friend prescribed for princes all its substances. Contemporary 18.3 Conceptions of Sovereignty. The earliest scholars to espouse the doctrine of sovereignty explicitly is the French philosopher and thinker Jean Bodin, 1529-96. Writing at a time when France was rife with religious and civil conflicts, Bodin, like Machiavelli, asserted that such conflicts could be solved if it was possible to establish the existence of an unrestricted ruling power, complement to overrule all religious and customary authority. He then went on to develop this notion into what is regarded as a classic statement of modern theory of sovereignty, that there must be within every political community or state a determinate sovereign authority whose powers are decisive and whose powers are recognized by the community as the rightful basis of authority. In the Six Books of a Commonwealth in 1576, Bodin presented sovereignty as the untrammeled and undivided power to make laws. Law is accordingly nothing else than the command of the sovereign in the exercise of his sovereign power. The sovereign power cannot be subject to the commands of another, for it is the sovereign that makes law for the subject. Bodin did not, however, advocate or justify despotic rule, but rather claimed that the sovereign monarch was constrained by the existence of a higher law in the form of will of God or natural law. The sovereignty of temporal rulers was therefore underpinned by the divine authority. Bodin believed that a sovereign authority could only be properly established if body politic was regarded as being composed of both ruler and ruled, integrated, as previous beliefs and politics had failed to integrate them. Bodin, preoccupied as he was with establishing the necessity of monarchical sovereignty, did not focus on the tensions inherent in idea of a sovereign power, comprising both the ruler and the ruled. The three most important members of the social contract school, Hobbes, Lokkei, and Rousseau, dwelt on this theme, but they did not agree on the nature of sovereign power and the criteria of legitimacy of government and state. At the one extreme was Hobbes, who provided a classic statement about state sovereignty, and at the other end was Rousseau, who developed the doctrine of popular sovereignty. Writing at a time of political instability, the Civil War in England, Thomas Hobbes, like Bodin, sought to establish the necessity of an all-powerful sovereign capable of securing the conditions of peaceful and commodious living. But he went on to establish a unique relation of authority, the relation of sovereign to the subject, and a unique political power, by arguing that an all-powerful sovereign could be established only when the individuals lay down their right to all things. Hobbes based on his sovereignty on a covenant of each member of a community with another member to surrender all their rights and powers into the hands of one person or body, the Leviathan, which represented the abstract notion of the state, who thereby becomes the sovereign. Since the sovereign is not himself a party to the contract, it cannot be annulled by those who made it. Moreover, the sovereign had the monopoly and the right to use coercive power because man's ambitions, avarice, anger, and other passions are so strong that the covenants without the sword are but words and of no strength to secure a man at all. The authority of the sovereign is therefore permanent, undivided, and ultimately unlimited. Hobbes' conception of sovereignty thus provided a strong justification for state power. If Hobbes had transferred sovereignty to the states and the rulers, Jean-Jacques Rousseau insisted on retaining sovereignty for the people. In Rousseau's view, sovereignty originates in the people. Citizens can only be obligated to a system of laws and regulations they have prescribed for themselves with the general good in mind. The sovereign authority is the people making the rules by which they live. In this perspective, the ruled should be the rulers. The affairs of the state should be integrated into affairs of ordinary citizens. Rousseau did not posit any limits on the decisions of the democratic majority. As Berlin pointed out, the community could easily destroy the liberty of all the individuals. Thus, if Hobbes placed the state in an all-powerful position with respect to the community, Rousseau placed the community, the majority, in a position to only dominate individual citizens. John Lokkei transcended the dualism between the ruler and the ruled, state and community by affirming the location of sovereignty in the polity as a whole. In this conception of sovereignty, the community is the source of sovereignty and the state is the proper instrument for its exercise. In Lokkei's scheme, the formation of the state does not signal the transfer of all subjects' right to the state. The subject transfers the law making and enforcement rights, but the whole process is conditional upon the state adhering to its essential purpose, the preservation of life, liberty, and estate. Thus, supreme power remains ultimately with the people, who retain the right to dispense with the rulers and even with the existence form of government. Reflections and Action 18.1. Comment upon the ideas of Roswei and Lokkei. With reference to sovereignty, write down your comments in a notebook. The ideas of Roswei and Lokkei had a powerful role in replacing dynastic rule with representative governments in Europe and later in other parts of the world. Though the subsequent history of the concept of sovereignty has been marked with dispute and complexity, there is a broad consensus that sovereignty is the supreme lawmaking and decision-making power of a community, that the ultimate source of sovereignty is the people, that sovereignty is necessarily delegated by the people to the state and exercised on their behalf through the government, and that constitutional arrangements are necessarily to safeguard these political goods. From the description of concepts of sovereignty, it is clear that while there is a consensus on the need for a determinate authority, there are differences on the nature of the supreme authority, whether it refers to the legal authority or unchangeable political power. There are also differences on its location, whether it lies with the state or with the people. In the following sections, we will dwell on these aspects before proceeding to examine the external sovereignty or the independent and autonomous status of the sovereign states in international relations. 18.4. Legal and political sovereignty. As we saw, Bodin argued for a sovereign who made laws but was not himself bound by those laws. Law, according to Bodin, amounted to little more than the command of the sovereign, and subjects were required simply to obey. Hobbes, on the other hand, described sovereignty in terms of power rather than authority. He defined sovereignty as a monopoly of coercive force, coercive power, and advocated that it be vested in the hands of a single person or body of person. This difference of emphasis on authority and power had led to the development of two distinct notions of sovereignty: legal sovereignty and political sovereignty. Legal sovereignty is based upon the belief that ultimate and final authority resides in the laws of the state. This is de jure sovereignty, supreme power defined
in terms of legal authority. In other words, it is based upon the right to require somebody to comply as defined by laws. By contrast, political sovereignty is not in any way based upon a claim to legal authority but is concerned simply about the actual distribution of power, that is de facto sovereignty. Political sovereignty, therefore, refers to the existence of a supreme political power possessed of the ability to command obedience because it is monopolizes coercive force. It should be noted that though one can analytically distinguish the two concepts in practice, they are closely related in practice. There are reasons to believe that on their own neither constitutes a viable form of sovereignty. In a sense of sovereignty always involves a claim to exercise legal authority, a claim to exercise power by right and not merely by virtue of force. All substantial claims to sovereignty therefore have a crucial legal dimension. Nevertheless, law on its own does not always secure compliance. There will be always some individuals and groups within a society who will disregard the laws of the state and commit crime. The state therefore has to have the ability to secure compliance. Legal authority has to be underpinned by the exercise of power. Box number 18.2, Political Conception of Sovereignty. All states seek a monopoly of coercive power and prevent or at least limit their citizens' access to it. But very few rules rule through the use of force alone. Almost all states have sought to persuade citizens that they have the right to rule. Such efforts to acquire legal sovereignty have in part contributed to the establishment of constitutional and democratic government. Some states, such as Nazi Germany, Pol Pot's Cambodia, came very close to establishing an exclusive political form of sovereignty. They ruled largely through their ability to repress, manipulate, and coerce, but they did not endure for long. Moreover, even these states have sought to acquire the metal of state legal authority by building up vast ideological apparatus. Thus, sovereignty in practice has meant the presence of both legal and political authority. A characteristic of sovereignty. Before we proceed to examine the external aspect of sovereignty, it will be useful to list out the characteristic of sovereignty emerging from the concepts of sovereignty. The key characteristics of sovereignty are explained below. Absoluteness. The sovereignty's authority is absolute and unlimited vice other associations in a society. It is absolute in the sense of not being subject to any restraints, legal or otherwise. Laws and decrees passed by the sovereign are binding on all citizens. Social groups and associations such as family, village, councils, clubs, trade unions, businesses can establish rules which command authority but only within the limit defined by the law. If the sovereign is subjected to either internal or external control of some other authority, that body ceases to be a sovereign. Exclusive. The sovereign power of the state is exclusive in the sense that no association is in a position to compete with it. There can be only one sovereign authority in the state which can legally command obedience of its inhabitants. Sovereignty does not accept any rival or parallel authority within the boundary of the state. Permanence. Sovereignty is self-perpetuating. As long as the state exists, it is the supreme form of authority. Despite changes of governments, the sovereignty of the state endures. Once sovereignty is lost, the state ceases to exist. Universality. The sovereign state exercises authority over all other individuals and groups of individuals within its jurisdictions. No group or persons can claim immunity from its jurisdictions as a matter of legal rights. Inalienability. The sovereignty of the state cannot be alienated. Since sovereignty forms the essential personality of the state, the very act of alienating it from the state would amount to the destruction of the state. As Labour put it, sovereignty can no more be alienated than a tree can alienate its right to sprout, or a man can transfer his life or personality to any other without self-destruction. Indivisible. In a state, there can be only one sovereign power. If sovereignty is divided, it implies that more than one state exists. Even if the exercise of sovereign power is shared among the branches of governmental machinery, the supreme authority is indivisible in terms of its pervasive, coercive command over other associations in the society. Agencies of government are mere functionaries of the sovereign. As we noted at the beginning of the unit, the concept of sovereignty has been used in two contrasting ways. In the form of internal sovereignty, it refers to the distribution of authority within a state and leads to questions about the need for supreme power and its location within the political system. In the form of external authority, it is related to the role of the state in the international order and to whether or not it is able to operate as an independent and autonomous actor on the world stage. It should be, however, noted that the two do not describe exclusive sorts of sovereignty, but different aspects of sovereignty that are coexistent and omnipresent. Sovereign authority is exercised within borders, but also by definition with respect to outsiders who accept its independence. 18.5 Internal sovereignty. The preceding discussions on the concept of sovereignty has been largely in terms of internal sovereignty. As we saw, much of modern political theory has been an attempt to divide precisely where sovereignty should be located. Early political thinkers such as Machiavelli, Bodin, and Hobbes were inclined to the belief that sovereignty should be vested in the hands of a single person, a monarch. The overriding merit of vesting sovereignty in a single individual was that the sovereignty would then be indivisible. It would be expressed in a single voice that could claim final authority, like Lokkei, Rousseau expressed in a single voice that could claim final. Lokkei, Rousseau, and the subsequent thinkers departed from this absolutist notion of sovereignty. They rejected monarchical rule in favor of notion of popular sovereignty, the belief that ultimate authority is vested in the people themselves. This doctrine of popular sovereignty is generally regarded as the basis of modern democratic theory. While these thinkers disagreed about who or what the ultimate authority should be, they were united in their belief that sovereignty could be and should be located in a determinate body. This is the traditional doctrine of sovereignty, which is also called the monistic theory of sovereignty. Even Rousseau, who espoused popular sovereignty, acknowledged that the general will was indivisible whole which could only be articulated by a single individual, who be called the legislator. This traditional doctrine of sovereignty has come under growing criticism in an age of pluralistic and democratic government. John Fricks, Harold J. Lusky, and other pluralists have argued that the monistic theory is intrinsically linked to its absolutist past and so is frankly undesirable. They emphasize that political power in any given society does not rest only in the state apparatus, but is shared by a number of groups and institutions other than the state in that society. Moreover, they point out that it is no longer applicable to modern systems of government which operate according to a network of checks and balances. For a pluralist, liberal democratic principles are the very antithesis of sovereignty. While the pluralists caution against the danger of elected or majority and call for restraining and influencing the excesses of the sovereign power of the state, all the same they seems to miss the point that the monist position is that of legal theory of sovereignty. That is, state alone has compulsively and universal jurisdiction in its territory. It alone legally can use the coercive power against those who break its law. This right of the state is recognized by all the citizens. Other associations may use power, but their right may not be accepted by all individuals. They may appeal against their actions to the higher authorities, and the state is the highest authority. There can be no appeal against the sovereign action of state. B. Locating sovereignty. After the English and the French revolutions in 1688 and 1789 respectively, the representatives and constitutional governments that were established initially in the West and later in other parts of the world assumed different forms. The task of locating sovereignty in representative governments in particularly difficult. The English jurist John Austin, investigating who in the name of the people or the state exercise sovereignty in Britain, came to the conclusion that it is neither vested in the crown nor in the people, but in the monarch in parliament. This was the supreme organ that enacted laws binding on everybody else, but that was not itself bound by the laws of and could change these laws at will. However, as we shall see later, this idea of legislative or parliamentary supremacy fitted only a particular system of government that prevailed in Britain in the 19th century. The idea of legislative supremacy does not fit well in federal states such as the United States, Canada, Australia, and India, where government is divided into two levels, each of which exercise a range of autonomous powers. Federalism is often said to involve a division of power between those two levels, between the center and the states or constituent unit. However, in the developing of the notion of a shared or divided sovereignty, federalism moves the concept away from the classical belief in a single and indivisible sovereign power. It may furthermore be suggested that neither level of government can finally be described as sovereign because sovereignty rests with the document which appropriates power to each level, the Constitution. But then, since the power to interpret the Constitution lies with the Supreme Court, one can argue that sovereignty resides with the Supreme Court. However, the Supreme Court cannot be properly be portrayed as a supreme constitutional arbiter since its interpretations of the constitutions can be overturned by amendments to the original document. In this sense, sovereignty can be said to be reside within the institution empowered to amend the constitution. In the United States, it is two-thirds majority in both the houses of Congress and three-quarters of America states legislatures or in a convention specifically called for the purpose. In India, it is two-thirds majorities in both the houses of parliament and other houses of the state. To complicate matter further, it can be argued that sovereignty in India ultimately is vested in India's people themselves. This is expressed in the preamble to the Constitution, which opens with the words, "We the people." In view of these complexities, or a polycentric concept of sovereignty has taken root in federal state. It has long been argued that in Britain, in a single unchallenged legal authority exists in the form of the Westminster Parliament. In the words of John Stuart Mill, Parliament can do anything except turn a man into a woman. Being a unitary form of government, no rival legislatures exist to challenge the authority of Parliament. All legislation derives from a single source. However, it can be argued that in reality, the British Parliament enjoys neither legal nor political sovereignty. Its legal sovereignty has been compromised by membership of the European Union. As a European Union member, Britain is obliged to conform to European law and is thus subject to the jurisdictions of the European Court of Justice in Luxembourg. In fact, the European Court in 1991 declared The Merchant Shipping Act of 1988, passed by the British Parliament, to be unlawful because it contravened European laws guaranteeing a free movement of goods and persons within the European community, as the EU was then. If Parliament can any longer be described as legally sovereign, it is only by virtue of the fact that it remains the legal right to withdraw from the European Union. In political terms also, the Parliament has never enjoyed sovereignty in the sense of acting as its please. Its behavior has always been constrained by a wide range of institutions, including the electorate, organized interest, particularly those which possess financial or economic muscle, major trading partners, supranational organization, international treaties, and so forth. Reflections and actions 18.2. Does sovereignty lies in the state or the political community? Discuss with other students and friends. To conclude, sovereignty resides in the state of political community as a whole. Give the complex checks and balances that operates in democratic states and the international and external constraints that operates on the states. Questions related to the precise location of sovereignty appear to have become outdated. It is the issue of external sovereignty that is independent vis-a-vis other states in the international order that has become absolutely vital. Let us focus on this aspect of sovereignty. 18.6. External sovereignty. Sovereignty as seen from inside a state is supreme authority, and as seen from outside is self-governing authority. In other words, external sovereignty refers to the state's place in the international order and therefore to its sovereign independence in relation to others. In international relations, sovereignty has become synonymous with the state power. It is useful to conceive of external sovereignty as constitutional independence. The state possesses a constitution, written or unwritten, democratic or otherwise, which makes it independent from other states. State sovereignty, in the sense of constitutional independence, consists of being apart from other similar entities. The moment a state established a constitutional link with another state, it loses its sovereignty, for it is constrained within a wider scheme. External sovereignty, in other words, implies that there is no higher political authority over the state. The sovereign state has the exclusive jurisdictions over its territory, its occupants, resources, and events that takes place there. Box 18.3. Westphalian International Society. Westphalian International Society was based on two principles. The first principle was Rex est imperator in regno sua. The king is emperor in his own realm. This norm specifies that sovereigns are not subjected to any higher political authority. Every king is independent and equal to each other king. The second principle was Cujus region, ejus regio. The ruler determines the religion of his realm. This norm specifies that outsiders has no right to intervene in a sovereign jurisdiction and on religious grounds. The practice of sovereignty underlying the contemporary state system is generally traced to the Peace of Westphalia, the set of treaties that marked the end of the 30-year war in 1648. While this is a gross oversimplification of complicated process that developed over centuries, however, by the 17th century, some of the features of the state system had solidified in two broad respects. The system of sovereign state triumphed as Westphalia. First, states emerged as virtually the sole form of constitutional authority in Europe. Secondly, it brought to an end intervention in matters of religion, up to then the most commonly practiced abridged or sovereign prerogatives. The principle of exclusive jurisdictions over people and resources within its territory has been codified by many agreements and treaties. The character of the United Nations, for instance, incorporated the principle of territorial integrity and political independence in Article 2 for thus members shall refrain in their international relations from the treat or use of force against the territorial integrity or political independence of any state or in any other manner consistent with the purpose of the United Nations. External sovereignty also established the basic condition of international relations, anarchy, meaning the absence of a higher authority over the states. This is no rule making and rule enforcing institutions in international relations. Anarchy or the absence of higher political authority above the states does not necessarily imply chaos or absence of order. In fact, although there is no international government, there exists a rule governed social order in international relations. States, initially free of obligations to one another, have accepted a whole body of formal and informal rules. For instance, international law rules governing diplomacy and recognition of spheres of influence, etc. Many of the formal and rules accepted by the states restrict their freedom of action in certain activities and spheres. Moreover, because of the uneven distribution of power capabilities of states, the powerful states have greater freedom of actions than the weaker states. Some scholars therefore talk this erosion of state sovereignty or its being present only in a great powers. But it should be noted sovereignty is not autonomy or freedom of action but constitutional independence. The distinctions between autonomy and independence is the distinction between political and legal sovereignty. And the states may be losing the ability to do what they want but not their right to do so. If sovereignty is understood in a political terms, one can argue that from the inception of the state system, states had not much freedom of action. But if sovereignty is understood to mean the basic of organizing principles of international relations, that is, in order structured around sovereign states, then nothing much has changed. International commitments that can place restrictions on state domestic policies are those that have been voluntarily accepted by states as sovereign entities. In contemporary international relations, the most basic norms, principles, and practices continue to rest on the state sovereignty. While the principle of external sovereignty is widely recognized and enshrined as a basic principle of international law, it is not without its critics. There are those who draw our attention to the sinister implications of granting each state exclusive jurisdiction over its own territory, people, and resources. Human rights advocacy groups, for instance, provide abundant evidence of state capacity to abuse, terrorize, and even exterminate their own population and argue for intervention in states. They insist that states should conform to a higher set of moral principles, usually expressed in the doctrine of human rights. Attempts have been made to embody such principles in international law, notably in the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights. Then there are those critics who suggest that the classical argument for sovereignty should go beyond national sovereignty. Thinkers such as Bodin and Hobbes emphasize that sovereignty was the only alternative to disorder, chaos, and anarchies. Yet, this is precisely what a rigorous application of the principle of national sovereignty would turn international politics into. Just as the absence of an international sovereign leads to brutality and injustice in interpersonal and intrasocietal relations, so does the absence of a supreme international authority leads to illegal interventions by powerful states and disputes and armed conflicts between states. In this way, the classical doctrines of sovereignty can be turned to an argument for world government. 18.7 Conclusion. Sovereignty is a contentious concept in domestic and international relations. As we saw, the concept developed as an instrument for the assertion of royal authority over feudal lords in the construction of modern territorial states. Political thinkers from Machiavelli and Rousseau believed that the inabilities and disorder were obstacles to a stable society and could only be overcome via a government that could firmly establish sovereignty over territory and population. While political thinkers differed on the location of sovereignty and therefore the form of government, they were united in believing that the only a determinate authority had the capacity to maintain order. The concept of sovereignty was then integrated into theories of international relations through a set of ideas that evolved over a period of time but got established in Stalfia world that entered the moral authority of the church over secular rulers. Though external sovereignty has undergone major changes as a result of the international commitment made by sovereign state as well as because of growing independence of states, the basic international norms, principles and practices continue to rest on state sovereignty, that is constitutional independence of states. 18.8 Further reading. Let's say genealogy of sovereignty, then other social principles and democratic state, and low power and sovereign state, and political theory and the modern state, essays on state and power and democracy, and the other one is sovereignty second edition, and the practice of sovereign statehood in contemporary international society, and sovereignty in an inquiry into the political good. Another book is Sovereign Coordinate Hypocrisy. Then Revolutions in Sovereignty, How Ideas Shape Modern International Relations. And last one is The Sovereign State and Its Competitors. So this is some further reading and reference. This is the end of the Unit 18 Sovereignty.